To get us started this week, I asked one of my good friends, Kevin Kolb, to share on the topic of following God's will even when it's hard. And you're going to hear as he talks about this life-changing decision that he truly felt God was leading him in, and how God worked in his life and through his life to help him process how to know God's will even when it's hard.
Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Kolb, and I've been asked to talk to you about following God's will, even when it's hard. The reason Randy asked me to talk on this topic is over the last year, I faced the difficult decision of leaving a fruitful ministry at Grace Baptist Church in St. Charles, Missouri, and accepting the position as pastor of Seminole Baptist Temple in Springfield. I'm humbled today to speak to you from the auditorium here at Seminole and to bear the responsibility of this historic church. I'm going to share with you today a little bit about the process, and I hope that it will be an encouragement to you to follow God's will even when it's hard. I don't know where you're at today in pursuing God's will, but here's some assumptions I'm making about you. Number one, ministry where you're at is probably hard because ministry is hard. Also, for some of you, ministry in a different location might look really appealing right now. But I also assume that for those of you watching this talk, you want to do God's will. And I know this. We are faced with choosing to do God's will on a daily basis. Sometimes we do His will, and sometimes we fail to do His will. And that's what makes us thankful for His new morning mercies. Some of those decisions that we make might be life-altering, but most of the time when deciding God's will, it's just daily stuff. So let me offer this caution as I think about God's will and this talk. Don't interpret anything I say as an encouragement for you to leave your current ministry post. I was privileged to be at Grace Baptist for 25 years and found that some of my most fruitful time in ministry came in those latter years. So don't jump ship too quick. But as I share my story of pursuing God's will, we'll talk through 3 stages: discerning, deciding, and then doing God's will. So I began to discern God's will early last year in May concerning this opportunity. Now, wouldn't it be great if God told us exactly where to go and what to do? Well, there were some biblical characters where that's what he did. Like Moses, for example, at the burning bush. God told him, hey, go to Egypt and interact with Pharaoh and throw down the stick, all of those things, and then lead my people out. Think of Jonah. God told him, go to Nineveh and preach. So God told both of those guys exactly what he wanted, but neither one of them obeyed from the heart instantly, willfully, and joyfully. Other characters in the Bible made wisdom-based decisions. I think of David when he faced Goliath. God didn't tell him to do that, but because of what he valued, God's will and God's testimony as a nation, he decided to face Goliath and deal with that threat. Also, Paul, when he was making ministry decisions about where to go and what to do and who to speak to and ministry philosophy, those were all wisdom-based decisions that he made in different locations at different times. These guys weren't always told directly what to do, but they were given guidance and they lived based on what they valued most. Some days our decisions concerning God's will seems bigger than normal. That was the case in my life last May when I was asked if I would submit a resume for the open position here at Seminole. I waited for God to speak, then He didn't tell me anything. So I knew it would be a wisdom-based decision, and it would be a hard one for me to make. One of the key questions when it comes to making ministry decisions that pastors and missionaries and full-time workers have to regularly answer is, whose will they pursue? Will we pursue our own will, other people's will, or God's will? If I pursue my will, I'm going to look for what's easy, for what's going to be comfortable, what's smooth, maybe what gets Kevin fame and glory. If I'm following other people's will, I'll be pressured to conform or to live in fear of failure or approval or to live up to other people's expectations. But if we are pursuing God's will, we're going to live for His glory and fame, which we know includes our sanctification, our obedience, and our dependence upon Him. Because this was a hard decision, I needed to constantly consider what it was that would be controlling me to help me stay focused on doing God's will. So here were three things that controlled me, or I wanted to control me: service, submission, and what it was that I valued. So I asked myself, well, how can I serve God's people at Seminole best in this process? When I was invited here to speak last May, I had the opportunity to encourage them from Revelation 4 to turn their eyes on the Lord and not look to the pastor, their future pastor, as the source of their hope. I think that was an encouragement to them at the time. When I submitted my resume later in May, I strove for honesty and clarity to help the search committee know exactly who I was and what my core philosophy of ministry was. I included a page that articulated 4 key philosophies of ministry, which explained both how and why of my approach to ministry. And during the interview process with the search committee, I prayed and I asked other people to pray that I would just be myself rather than who I thought they might be looking for. How can I serve God's people? That was a controlling question. Another one was that I constantly asked was, who should I submit to in this process? Because Kevin's heart is deceitful, right, and is going to struggle to pursue his own will, I wanted to submit to God's will. So there were 5 people for sure, right up front, I had to ask even before I could submit a resume. First of all was my wife. She told me when we got married that she would follow me anywhere. I really put her to the test when I said, you might have to follow me back to the pressure cooker of ministry in Springfield. But she is willing, and I'm so thankful for her. The elders of grace were 4 other brothers that I needed to submit to. So I went at the next elders meeting and I asked them, hey, I've been considering submitting my resume to Seminole. They asked a few clarifying questions in my life, and then they gave me permission to submit the resume and told me to go as far as God wanted me to go in the process, as long as I kept them informed and that they could encourage me and pray with me through that. I'm so thankful for my brothers at Grace who encouraged me in that. I also had to submit to the process. The search team here at Seminole had committed to this congregation to not leave any stone uncovered when it came to vetting the next pastor. So that meant I needed to submit myself to the questions, the interviews, and the rounds of those, along with written explanations that at times, quite honestly, for me, got frustrating. In fact, at one point, I had to ask the committee for their forgiveness because I felt like I was becoming irritated with them. They forgave me, and we continued in the process. And then ultimately, I had to submit to my own home church. Once the deacons at Seminole invited me to candidate publicly in lieu of a call here, I knew I needed to go to Grace and tell them. So on the first Sunday of November last year, I announced to Grace that I would be candidating at Seminole. A last controlling question that I had to constantly ask myself, which the time of the process of discerning God's will allowed me, was what do I value most? That was a really helpful question for me to ask and to answer. And what it was for me in my life was I valued Christ's church most. I longed for Christ's bride to be as beautiful as possible when Christ returns, that she would be glorious to him. So in order to candidate at one church, I had to risk being misunderstood at another church. I valued pursuing God's will at Seminole more than my approval at Grace. I knew I was risking being misunderstood or potentially losing face with the church that I loved and had served. Well, when I informed Grace that I would be spending the month of November candidating at Seminole, I asked them to pray with me about that and to potentially send me. I received a very loving response from that church. They were so encouraging to me to pursue God's will. In fact, one brother put it this way. As he shook my hand, he said, "You've taught our church to be a sending church. Why wouldn't we send you?" And so I was so thankful for the response that I received from Grace. What did I value most? That was a helpful question for me to answer. Total time spent in this discerning process for me, in this instance, was about 6 months. But that was very helpful for me as I waited and wondered and asked and answered questions to prepare my own heart, to grow my marriage, and to discern what God might be doing both at the church in St. Charles and the church here in Springfield. So after discerning God's will, I had to decide. I had to make a decision. But I had to make a decision within God's will. See, one of my elder friends at Grace told me multiple times through the process, "Kevin, at some point you're going to have to make a choice." And as much as I knew he was right, I didn't really want to consider that reality. Now, you might disagree with me, and that's okay, but I believe I could have remained at Grace and continued to serve the Lord there at that church, or come to Seminole and serve God here. I've always believed that God's will is not a matter of location, but it's a matter of obedience wherever you are. So as I progressed in the process, I kept hoping that God would kind of close the door, not because I didn't want to come to Seminole, but I didn't want to have to choose between two ministries. But sometimes God's will is not about choosing between right and wrong, but about choosing between both things that are right. So what do we do in those moments? How do we make that decision? Well, it can't be based on the opportunity, because we have an opportunity to do both. And we can't make the decision based on what is difficult and what is easy, right? Because we don't know the future of either church. And we know leading God's flock comes with pressure, no matter where you're at. And I couldn't make the decision based on what I even desired. I didn't know my own heart's desire. My desire went back and forth at many times. In fact, there were times I had to pray the garden prayer that with Jesus, like, not my will, Lord, your will be done. So what it came down to for me was this. Well, where did I think the Lord could best use me at this point in my life and ministry? For some of my friends, that wasn't good enough. But that's what tipped the decision to candidate, and if extended the call to accept the position here at Seminole. I chose the open post at Seminole over the comfort and continuity that my position at Grace Baptist offered me, and that was a hard decision. I'm now at the final stage of decision making. So after discerning and deciding, it's time for the doing. Like, I have to do God's will. Well, while there's many joys and privileges in returning to Springfield and serving at the church here as lead pastor, there's certainly challenges that I'm facing. You can pray for me about those. See, accepting position at Seminole meant I had to relocate. It meant leaving my home where I raised my kids, saying goodbye to friends and family, and that has proved hard. My heart goes out to all you missionaries who've done that multiple times for this cause of Christ and doing God's will. And I know there's a reward for you in heaven someday because of that. Another challenge in accepting the position at Seminole is just facing the fear of man issue in a fresh way. See, in Grace, they knew me. It's probably easier for me to be myself and let the chips fall. Now, I'm daily faced with wanting people to like me more than wanting God to be pleased with me. So you can pray with me about that challenge. And another challenge is daily deciding to lead Seminole based on truth rather than tradition. I can't allow the driving question to be, how did I do things at Grace? Or what is Seminole's identity or customs? See, both of those things enter into the conversation. But what has to first guide my daily decision to do God's will is, what does the Bible say? And that can be a challenge. As we continue to put our lives in the Lord's hand and serve the local church and get ready for his return, we will have daily opportunities to do God's will, which often means accepting challenges. So let me encourage you about following God's will even when it's hard. Number one, let me encourage you to pursue God's revealed will daily. And his revealed will is in his word. If you spend time in the word and you obey the word, 3 years down the road, you're not going to wake up and find yourself out of God's will. So just obey God's revealed will daily. Number two, don't jump ship when God's will is hard. It's okay that God's will for you today is hard. Difficulties are a normal part of God's will for his servants in this life. Those difficulties sharpen us and they challenge us. They refine us. So trust him. Faithful is he who called you. He will do it. Thirdly, let me encourage you that we will enter into rest someday, but not until our final day, right? This period of life is a time that's going to be marked by tribulation, trial, service, and labor. And that's okay. And finally, let me encourage you, when there's more than one right door for you to walk through, don't go through it alone. Commit to the process, even if it takes some time. Don't be afraid when it's time to make the choice, and then do it. Go to work. Do God's will. What's the rest of the story? Well, Seminole has graciously welcomed myself and my family into this ministry position. And I'm so encouraged to be here, and I'm excited for what God has in store for Seminole. I'm also encouraged greatly for what God's doing at Grace. They've recently called my brother Curtis to be their lead pastor, and there's a great deal of unity and as they continue their mission there. So good job, Grace Baptist. Thanks for your time today. I hope this talk has been an encouragement to you. And if you would like to continue the conversation about following God's will, even when it's hard, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to walk with you through that decision.